This is Dr. Stansel with a lecture called Intro to Carvakan and Nyaya Epistemologies. The Carvaka school and the Nyaya school are two schools of Indian philosophy, and by Indian here, I'm referring to the culture of the Indian subcontinent in South Asia. The Carvaka school is ancient, belongs to the era roughly between 600 and 300 BCE. We don't have any complete original source texts from the Carvaka school, so we may not have a complete picture of the philosophy, but what we know of it is that the Carvakans promoted materialism. They argued that a human being is just their body and doesn't have a soul. And they argued that we shouldn't believe in God's existence. So they're known as atheists. The Nyaya school, on the other hand, belongs to a later era of Indian philosophy, the classical era. And we have ample source texts from the Nyaya school. They produce quite a lot of literature and it's quite sophisticated. So, what we'll be studying in our course is just really just a very little bit of what the Nyaya school produced. Their philosophy is dualist. They do believe in a body and a soul, and a theist. They do argue for God's existence and a path for the soul's liberation. By the way, in later eras, Nyaya joined with, sort of merged together with another school called Vaisheshika, and so in later history came to be called the Nyaya Vaisheshika school, and I just mentioned that in case you see that come up in a reading. Let me introduce you to Carvakan epistemology, and that is their philosophy of knowledge. Carvakans had a very straightforward and a very simple view that perception is the only valid basis of knowledge. They held that we can only claim to know things which are backed up by direct perception. Now, according to Carvakans, perception happens only in the present moment. So I'm only perceiving what I'm perceiving right now. They didn't trust memory, and they didn't count our memories of past perceptions as a valid perception or a source of knowledge. So, what are the kinds of things that I can truly know according to Carvaka? I know that I'm sitting at my desk. I know that I'm speaking because I hear myself speaking. I know that I'm working on my computer because I can see my computer. And what I can know are only the things I'm perceiving right now. Since they don't trust memory, they also can't trust inference. What's an inference? It's something like this. Let's say I'm looking at a mountain and I see smoke rising from the other side of the mountain, and it's a mountain covered with trees. And I think to myself, where there's smoke, there's fire. Therefore, there must be fire on the other side of the mountain. The inference allows me to perceive the smoke and then ultimately come to know something beyond the smoke. I can come to know that there's fire on the mountain. And there's this intermediary step, between the smoke and the fire, and that is the previous knowledge that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. So Carvakans will argue that we can't know these wherever statements. We can't know that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Because even if we've seen smoke and fire together in the past hundreds of times, by now, as I stand here looking at this mountain, all those past experiences of smoke and fire are mere memories. And since they don't trust memory, they don't think that we can know that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Therefore, I can't perform this inference or any other kind of inference. Okay, so they don't trust memory, they don't trust inference, they don't trust other people's testimony. So if someone comes to me and says, there's a fire on the mountain, or really anything that someone else tells me, I read in a book that Paris is the capital of France, or the newscaster tells me it's going to freeze tonight. The Carvakans will argue that since we haven't perceived these things ourselves, then we can't truly know that Paris is the capital of France or it's going to freeze tonight. Of course, they would also say that the newscaster doesn't know it's going to freeze tonight because this is a claim about the future that hasn't happened yet. By analogy, they're referring to these comparisons we make. Like, for example, if we know that certain types of mammals have a certain protein in their tissue, then other types of mammals, by analogy, should have this protein as well. So analogy means comparison or analogy. It's on the list here because the Nyaya school will endorse this as a form of knowledge, and I'll get to that on the next slide. Carvakans don't trust scripture as a source of knowledge, but some schools of classical Indian philosophy did endorse scripture as a valid source of knowledge. Okay, I want to share with you the Carvakan argument about animal footprints on the path to the village. One of the arguments that we do have from the Carvaka school goes something like this. The people may wake up in the morning and see what look like animal footprints on the dusty dirt path into their village. And they may become very afraid because when they see what look like animal footprints, they seem to draw an inference and come to the conclusion that there is a dangerous animal like a wolf in the village, or that there was a dangerous animal in the village overnight, and they become scared. And the Carvakans expressed sort of disdain and a judgmental attitude about this type of worry, because they said, since you didn't see the footprints being made, you really don't know how they were made, and for all you know, a mischievous member of the village could have been out there, in the middle of the night, making these marks in the path, maybe with their fingertips, just to scare everybody. Carvakans are skeptical about the use of inference, and they will consistently argue that if you did not perceive something directly, then you don't know that it exists, or that it was there, or that it's true. Perception is the only valid basis of knowledge, and by this they mean direct perception. And they do have a disdainful attitude toward people who are willing to endorse other forms of justifying or producing knowledge. Nyaya philosophers, on the other hand, recognize four sources of knowledge: perception, including our memories of past perceptions; inference, like the one I described with the last slide. I see smoke on the mountain. I know that wherever there's smoke, there's fire. Therefore, there's fire on the mountain. And they're able to trust inference because they accept memories of past perceptions as a source of knowledge. And so we can come to know things like wherever there's smoke, there's fire. They talk about criteria for knowing a general claim like that. And of course, it has to be that we have seen smoke and fire together at the same place sometime in the past. We're not seeing the smoke and the fire together on the mountain right now, but if we have seen them directly together before, then we have what we need to perform this inference now about the fire on the mountain. They recognize analogy or comparison as a valid source of knowledge, and also testimony. And for each of these things, they talk about the criteria that are required, of course. So not just any testimony, not just any analogy. For testimony to be a valid source of knowledge, they'll say the testimony has to come from an authoritative source who has not lied before. So I did say earlier that the Nyaya school produced a lot of writing, and some of what they do in that written body of work is they discuss these sources of knowledge and when and how and why they are valid. All I'm doing is introducing you to this stuff here. So what would the Nyaya philosophers say about the animal footprints on the path to the village? They would say that if we have directly seen an animal making a footprint just like that in the past, and then we look now and we see the very same type of footprint, then yes, we can draw an inference based on this footprint, and we can infer that a dangerous animal like a wolf, was here or is still in the village. Also, suppose we know that no one in the village has the artistic skill to make this kind of print. That can further bolster our inference. I want you to think about a time when you have seen an animal print on a path out in the woods or on a ranch. Animal prints can be very, very clear and distinct. You can get a really good impression in a dusty path, and they really do look a certain way. It would be hard to fake. And let's set aside for now the idea of creating a plastic mold and pressing it in just the right way into the dust, because of course, Nyaya philosophers didn't have access to that technology, but let's just set that aside for a moment. I think what we see here in the difference between Carvakan and Nyaya is that the Carvakans are willing to say, who knows, you never know, anything could happen. And the Nyaya philosophers are not willing to go there. They're going to say, look, you get down, you look at this footprint, and it looks exactly like the kind of print or prints you saw a wolf making in the woods a couple weeks ago. And let's say you also know that there's no one in the village who has the artistic skill. Your village is a finite number of people. You know them all, and no one has the skill to make a print like this. it's just the most reasonable conclusion that an animal did walk through the village. And then the Nyaya philosophers will, like I said before, they're very aware of how knowledge leads to action, and I think in a lot of cases, knowledge will directly lead to action where we don't even we don't necessarily stop and think about it first. We just act. We see the smoke coming from the mountain or from a building, and we see it and we just go get water. So they're viewing knowledge as very much contextualized, very much embedded in the dynamic life of an active agent. And perhaps the Charvakans, by contrast, are taking more of a, I don't know, more of the view of the philosopher sitting back in the armchair. The person who's willing to say, well, you never know. Anything might have made those marks in the dust. So perhaps the Charvakans are taking more of the armchair philosopher attitude, where the Nyaya philosophers are perhaps more tuned into the man of action and the day-to-day lives that we lead of action and identifying problems and taking care of those problems. Before I conclude the lecture, I'd like to talk about the Nyaya conception of knowledge and contrast it with what is the most common Western view. And so I'll start there. Most commonly, Western philosophers view knowledge as justified true belief. And they will hold that for something to truly count as knowledge, the knower must be able to justify that knowledge. The knower must understand what support they have for that knowledge. They must be certain of their knowledge and free from doubt. So, under this view, possessing knowledge is a very intellectual thing. I need to know what I know, and I need to be able to back up what I know. So under this view, a baby wouldn't be said to quote unquote know anything because they don't know that they know and they can't back it up. According to the Nyaya school, knowledge is true belief formed in a valid way. The view's quite different. Under their view, a baby does know a lot of things. When the baby is in the room with their mother, they have a perception of their mother. This counts as knowledge, according to Nyaya philosophers. If the baby is in the room with their mother, and they see mom and they say, Mama, they have a belief that mom is in the room, and it's a true belief, and it was formed in a valid way. How? Through perception. So according to the Nyaya conception of knowledge, the baby has knowledge. Similarly, when the mailman comes to your door to deliver your mail, your dog goes crazy and starts barking at the mailman. According to the Nyaya conception of knowledge, the dog has knowledge. The dog thinks the mailman is there. This is a true belief. It was formed in a valid way, namely through perception. So this conception of knowledge is called externalism. And we can kind of think of it as, the knower doesn't need to know that they know. They don't need to be able to justify their knowledge. They don't need to be able to be certain about their knowledge. But some external observer can look at the knower and say, well, they believe something, it's true, it was formed in the right way, they have knowledge. So, for example, we can look at the baby and say, the baby believes that its mom is present. It's saying, mama, mama, it's reaching out its hands, and the baby believes this because they are looking at their mom. So the baby has knowledge. So, whereas in Western philosophy of knowledge, we have, for example, a very famous piece by Rene Descartes where he is sitting and meditating on his own knowledge and questioning its validity. He's questioning whether his knowledge is justified. Is he certain? Is he free from doubt? And so on. Nyaya philosophers are not taking that kind of self-reflective approach. Rather, as they explore what knowledge is, they look at what knowledge is in other people around them, and they describe what it takes for people to have knowledge. And what they come to is, well, people have knowledge when they have a true belief, and it was formed in a valid way. So, if a person has a true belief by accident, or because they misunderstood something, but they still come up with something true, right? A Nyaya philosopher will not consider that knowledge. Or maybe, someone has a true belief, but it's just something they want to believe, but it's really still a product of fantasy or desire. It happens to be true. Nyaya philosophers will not count that as knowledge. But if someone believes something and it's true, and they arrived at this belief through perception, inference, analogy, or testimony, then a Nyaya philosopher will consider it knowledge.